It was just past 12:30 a.m. Sabbath arrived in New York and found a spot for the car a few blocks from Norman Cowan's Central Park West apartment. He hadn't been back to the city in nearly 30 years. Yet Upper Broadway, in the dark of night, looked much as he remembered it when he used to set up his screen outside the 72nd Street subway station and put on a rush-hour finger show. The side streets seemed to him unchanged, except for the bodies bundled up in rags, in blankets, under cardboard cartons, bodies encased in torn and shapeless clothing, lying up against the masonry of the apartment buildings and along the railings of the brownstones. April, and yet they were sleeping out of doors. Sabbath knew about them only what he'd overheard Rosanna saying on the phone to the do-gooding friends. For years he had not read a paper or listened to the news if he could avoid it. The news told him nothing. The news was for people to talk about, and Sabbath, indifferent to the untransgressive run of normalized pursuits, did not wish to talk to people. He didn't care who was at war with whom, or where a plane had crashed, or what had befallen Bangladesh. He did not even want to know who the president was of the United States. He'd rather fuck Drenka. He'd rather fuck anyone than watch Tom Brokaw. His range of pleasures was narrow and never did extend to the evening news. Sabbath was reduced the way a sauce is reduced, boiled down by his burners, the better to concentrate his essence and be defiantly himself. But mostly he did not follow the news because of Nicky. He couldn't leaf through a paper, anywhere, without searching still for some clue about Nicky. It was years before he was able to answer the ringing phone without thinking that it would be either Nicky or someone who knew about her. Crank calls were the worst. When Rosanna picked up the phone and it was an obscene caller or a breather, he would think, was it somebody who knew my wife? Somebody who was trying to tell me something? Could the breather have been Nicky herself? But did Nicky know where he'd moved to? Had she ever heard of Madamasca Falls? Did she know he had married Rosanna? Had she run away that night, leaving no hint of why she was going or where, because earlier in the evening she had seen him with Rosanna, the two of them crossing Tompkins Square Park and headed for his workshop? In New York, her disappearance was all he could think about. Out on the streets, it was obsessional. It had no end. And this was why he'd never return. Back when he was still in their apartment on St. Mark's Place, he never went out that he did not think he would pass her in the street, and so he looked at everybody and started following people. If a woman was tall and had the right hair, not that Nicky couldn't have dyed hers or taken to wearing a wig, he would follow her until he caught up, and then he would measure himself against the person, and if she was about right, would step around to look directly at her face. Let me see if this is Nicky. It never was, though he made the acquaintance of some of these women anyway, took them for coffee, took them for a walk, tried to fuck them, half the time did. But he did not find Nicky, nor did the police, or the FBI, or the famous detective who he went to hire with the help of Norman and Link. Back in those days, the 40s, the 50s, the early 60s, people didn't disappear the way they do today. Today, if somebody disappears, you're pretty sure. You immediately know what happened. They were murdered. They're dead. But in 1964, nobody thought the first thing of foul play. If there was no certification of their death, you had to believe they were alive. People didn't just drop off the edge of the earth with anything like the frequency they do now. And so Sabbath had to think she was alive somewhere. If there wasn't a body to bury physically, he could not bury her mentally. Although since moving to Madamasca Falls, he'd never told anybody, even Drenka, about the wife who disappeared. The fact was that Nicky wouldn't die until he did. He had moved to Madamasca Falls when he felt himself beginning to go crazy, looking for her on the New York streets. A person could still walk everywhere in the city in those days, and that's what he did. Walked everywhere, looked everywhere, found nothing. The police had distributed circulars to police departments all across the country and in Canada. Sabbath had himself sent out hundreds of circulars to colleges, to convents, to hospitals, to newspaper reporters, to columnists, to Greek restaurants in Greek towns all over America. The missing circular had been assembled and printed by the police. Nikki's photo, age, height, weight, and hair color, even what she was wearing. They knew what clothes she'd had on because Sabbath had spent a weekend going through her dresser and her closet until he was able to recall the items no longer there. She appeared to have left with only the clothes on her back. And how much money could she have had? $10? $20? Nothing had been drawn from their small bank account, and not even the pile of change on the kitchen table had been disturbed. She had not taken even that. A description of what she'd been wearing and her photo were all he could offer the detective. She had left no note, and, according to the detective, most people did. Voluntary disappearances, he called these. The detective took down from the shelf behind his desk whole loose-leaf notebooks, as many as 10 of them with pictures and descriptions of people who had disappeared and still not been located. "Usually," he said, "they leave something, a note, a ring." Sabbath told him that Nicky was obsessed with the dead mother she had loved and the living father she hated. Maybe she had been seized by an impulse. God knew she was a creature of impulse, and had flown out to Cleveland to forgive the crass vulgarian she had not seen since she was 7, or to murder him. Or perhaps, despite the fact that her passport was still in a drawer in their apartment, she had somehow made her way back to London and to the spot alongside the Serpentine in Kensington Gardens, where on a Sunday morning, with all the children floating their boats and flying kites, he had watched her scatter the ashes over the water. But she could be anywhere, everywhere. Where was the detective to begin? No, he wouldn't take the case. And so Sabbath went back to sending out more circulars, always with a hand-written letter from him that read, "This is my wife. She disappeared. Do you know or have you seen this person?" He sent the circulars to wherever his imagination could take him. He even thought of whorehouses. Nicky was beautiful, submissive, certainly eye-catching in America, with her long body and her long-nosed, black and white Greek looks. Maybe she'd wound up in a whorehouse like the college girl in Sanctuary. He could remember once, though only once, coming upon a young woman of great refinement in a whorehouse in Buenos Aires. 2 things, the American girl next door, that was Rosanna, and the exotic, Nicky, the romance of port life, brothel life, came together for him in New York when he started to go to whorehouses looking for his wife. There were places on Upper 3rd Avenue where you met the girl next door. You walked up the stairs into a kind of salon, and sometimes they tried to make it look like an old-fashioned salon out of Lautrec or some fake version of that. And there were young women lounging around. And there one found the girl next door, but never Nicky. He became a customer at 3 or 4 of these places and showed Nicky's picture to the madams. He asked if they'd ever seen her around. The madams all gave the same answer. "I wish I had." Then there were 50 or so letters addressed to him at the theater from people who had seen Nicky perform and who wanted to communicate their sympathy. He had stored the letters for her return in her dresser drawer, with the jewelry she had inherited from her mother, along with them the pieces he and the embalmer had removed from the corpse. She had not taken any of that, either. He could not forward her these letters. No, better, if he could send the writers, transport them to wherever she was hiding out, and seat her in a chair in the middle of the room, ask her to be still, and to let them pass before her one at a time, and take as long as they liked to tell her what she had meant to them in Strindberg, Chekhov, Shakespeare. Long before they'd all stepped up to deliver their emotional tributes, she would be weeping uncontrollably, not for her mother, but for herself now, and for the gift she had abandoned. And only after her last admirer had spoken would Sabbath enter the room, and here she would stand and put on her coat, the black, form-fitting coat that was missing from the closet, the one they'd bought together at Altman's, and without any resistance, allow him to lead her back to where she could feel coherent, of a piece, and strong, where she could think of herself as controlling events, if only for 2 hours, back to the stage, the only place on earth where she wasn't acting, and her demons ceased to be. Being on stage was what held her together, what held them together. The intensification she gave everything by stepping out under the lights. The unending mourning for her mother had made her unendurable to him. It was the actress he had to save. As with millions upon millions of young couples, in the beginning was the sexual excitement. However baffling a mixture, Nikki's narcissism, pure as a gushing geyser, and her stupendous talent for self-abnegation seemed faultlessly wedded in her when she lay nude on the bed imploringly, looking up to see what he would do with her first. And the soulfulness was there, that was always there, the romantic, ethereal side of her ineffectual protest against everything ugly, the taunt concavity that was her belly, the alabaster apple that was her cleft behind, the pale, maidenly nipples of a 15-year-old, the breasts so small that you could cup them in your hand the way you hold a ladybug to prevent its flying away, the impenetrability of the eyes that drew you in and told you nothing, yet told you nothing so eloquently. The excitement of the yielding of all that fragility. Merely looking down at her, he felt that his prick was about to burst. "You're a vulture standing there," she said. "Does that horrify you?" "Yes," she replied. They were both surprised by what they were doing together when he first struck her backside with his belt. Nikki, who was tyrannized by nearly everyone, displayed no true fear of being whipped a little. Not too hard, but the leather grazing at her, at first lightly, then not so lightly, as she lay obligingly on her stomach, put her into an exalted state. It's Tell me, it's tenderness going wild." It was impossible to tell who was imposing whose will on whom. Was it merely Nikki once again submitting, or was this the meat of her desire? There was a nonsensical side, too, of course, and more than once, disengaged from the drama by its comic dimension, Sabbath would leap up on the bed to portray that. "Oh, don't take it to heart," said Nikki, laughing. "Other things hurt more than that. For example, getting up in the morning. I like your base qualities so much, Nicoletta. I only wish I had more for you." "You will." Smiling and frowning at once, she said sadly, "I don't think so." "You'll see," said the triumphant puppeteer, standing statue-like above her, erection in one hand and the silky sash to tie her to the bedstead in the other. It was Nikki who turned out to be right. In time, item after item disappeared from the night table, the belt, the sash, the gag, the blindfold, the baby oil heated a little in a saucepan on the stove. After a while, he could enjoy fucking her only when they smoked a joint, and then it needn't have been Nikki who was there, or any human thing at all. Even the orgasms that so enthralled him began to bore him after a while. Climaxes overtook her seemingly from without, breaking upon her like a caprice, a hailstorm freakishly exploding in the middle of an August day. All that had been going on before the orgasm was for her some sort of attack that she did nothing to repel, but that, however arduous, she could endlessly absorb and easily survive. Yet the frenzy of her climax, the thrashing, the whimpering, the loud groaning, the opaque eyes staring fixedly upward, the fingernails digging into his scalp, that seemed a barely tolerable experience from which she might never recover. Nikki's orgasm was like a convulsion, the body bolting its skin. Rosanna's, on the other hand, had to be galloped after like a fox in the hunt, with herself in the role of a bloodthirsty fox huntress. Rosanna's orgasm required a great deal of her, an urging onward that was breathtaking to watch, until he grew bored watching that. Rosanna had to fight against something resisting her, and committed to another cause entirely. Orgasm was not a natural development, but an oddity so rare that it had to be laboriously hauled into existence. There was a suspenseful, heroic dimension to her achieving a climax. You never knew until the final moment whether or not she was going to make it, or whether you yourself could stand fast without an infarction. He began to wonder if there wasn't an exaggerated and false side to her struggle, as there is when an adult plays checkers with a child and pretends to be stymied by the child's every move. Something was wrong, seriously wrong. But then, when you'd about given up hope, she made it. She did it. In at the kill, riding atop him, her entire being compressed in her cunt. He eventually came to feel that he needn't have been there. He could have been one of those antique marionettes with a long wooden dick. He needn't have been there, so he wasn't. With Drenka, it was like tossing a pebble into a pond. You entered, and the rippling uncoiled sinuously from the center point outward until the entire pond was undulating and a quiver with light. Whenever they had to call it quits for the day or the night, it was because Sabbath was not just at the end of his endurance, but dangerously beyond it for a fatso over 50. "Coming is an industry with you," he told her. "You're a factory." "Old-timer," she said, a word he'd taught her while he struggled to recover his breath. "You know what I want next time you get a hard-on?" "I don't know what month that'll be." "Tell me now and I'll never remember." "Well, I want you to stick it all the way up." "And then what?" "Then turn me inside out over your cock, like somebody peels off a glove." After the first year, he began to fear that he might go mad looking for Nicky, and it didn't help any to leave town. Out of New York, he searched for her name in the local telephone directory. She could have changed it, of course, or shortened it, as Greek Americans frequently shortened their names for convenience sake. The short version of Kantarakis was generally Katris. At one point, Nicky had been thinking of taking Katris for a stage name, or that was the reason she gave. Perhaps not even herself understanding that a new name was not going to lessen in any way her loathing for the father who had made a decent life impossible for her mother. One winter day, Sabbath was flying back from a performance at a puppet festival in Atlanta when the weather in New York became stormy and his plane was diverted to Baltimore. In the waiting room, he went to a phone booth and looked up Kantarakis and Katris. There it was, N. Katris. He dialed the number but got no answer, and so he ran out of the airport and had a taxi take him to the address. The house was a brown wooden bungalow, not much more than a large shack on a street of little wooden bungalows. A "Beware Dog" sign was stuck into the ground in the middle of the untended front yard. He climbed the broken steps and knocked on the door. He wandered all around the house trying to look in the windows, even going so far as to climb almost to the top of the 6-foot-high wire mesh fence surrounding the front yard. One of the neighbors must have called the police because 2 officers drove up and arrested Sabbath. Only at the station house when he was able to phone Link and tell him what had happened and get him to explain to the police that Mr. Sabbath had indeed had a wife who had disappeared a year ago, were the charges dropped. Outside the station, despite the police's warning him against going back and prowling, he hailed another taxi to return him to the shack belonging to N. Katris. It was evening now, but there were no lights on. This time, in response to his knock, he got the barking of what sounded like a very large dog. Sabbath shouted, "Nicky, it's me. It's Mickey. Nicky, are you there? I know you are in there. Nicky, please, open the door." The only answer came from the dog. Nicky would not open the door because she never wanted to see the son of a bitch again, or because she was not there, because she was dead, because she had killed herself or had been raped and murdered and cut into pieces and thrown overboard in a weighted sack a couple of miles out to sea from Sheepshead Bay. To escape the increasing wrath of the dog, he ran to the next bungalow and knocked on that door. A black woman's voice called from within. "Who is that?" "I'm looking for your neighbor, Nicky." "For what?" "I'm looking for my wife, Nicky Katris." "Nope," was all he got back from her. "Next door, number 583, your neighbor, N. Katris. Please, I have to find my wife. She disappeared." The door was opened by an alarmingly thin and wrinkled elderly black woman, holding herself upright with a cane and wearing dark glasses. She spoke with tender amusement. "You beat her. Now you want her back to beat again." "I did not beat her." "How come she disappear?" "You beat a woman. She got half a brain. She run away." "Please, who lives next door? Answer me." "Your wife. She got herself a new boyfriend by now. And know what? He gonna beat her. Some woman is like that." With this observation, she shut the door. He got a flight to New York later that evening. It had taken that blind old black woman to get him to understand that he had been jilted, discarded, abandoned. She had spurned him, left a year ago with somebody else, and he was still out looking for her and grieving for her and wondering where she was. It wasn't him fucking Rosanna that had caused her to flee. It was Nicky fucking somebody new. At home, he began to fall apart for the first time since she had disappeared. And up with the Gelmans in Bronxville, he had cried in his room every night for 2 weeks. Rosanna was living with him in the apartment now, making her ceramic necklaces again and selling them to a shop in the village so they had some money to survive on. Sabbath's drama company had very nearly dissolved, and the audience had deserted him, largely because there was no one in the company, maybe no one her age in New York, with anything like Nicky's magic. Over the months, the acting had become worse and worse because of Sabbath's inattention. He would watch a rehearsal and see not a thing, and he rarely went out in the streets with his finger act because all he did out on the street was begin to look for Nicky, look at women and follow women. Sometimes he screwed them. Might as well. Rosanna had been hysterical when he reached home that night. "Why didn't you phone me? Where were you? Your plane landed without you. What was I to think? What do you think I thought?" In the bathroom, Sabbath got down on his knees on the tile floor and said to himself, "You can't do this anymore, or you will go crazy. Rosanna will go crazy. You will be insane for the rest of your life. I cannot cry about it ever again. Oh, God. Just don't let me do this ever again." Not for the first time, he thought of his mother, sitting on the boardwalk waiting for Morty to come back from the war. She never believed he was dead either. The one thing you can't think is that they're dead. They have another life. You give yourself all sorts of reasons why they haven't come home. You get into the rumor business. Somebody would swear he had seen Nicky performing under another name in a summer theater in Virginia. The police would report that somebody had spotted a crazy woman who resembled her description on the Canadian border. Only Link, when they were alone, had the courage to say to him, "Mick, don't you really know she's dead?" And the answer was always the same. "Where's the body?" No, the wound never closes. The wound remains fresh, as it had till the very end for his mother. She had been stopped when Morty was killed, stopped from going forward, and all the logic went out of her life. She wanted life, as all people do, to be logical and linear, as orderly as she made the house and her kitchen and the boys' bureau drawers. She had worked so hard to be in control of a household's destiny. All her life she waited not only for Morty, but for the explanation from Morty. Why? The question haunted Sabbath. Why? Why? If only someone will explain to us why, maybe we could accept it. Why did you die? Where did you go? However much you may have hated me, why don't you come back so we may continue with our linear, logical life like all the other couples who hate each other? Nicky had had a performance of Miss Julie that night. Nicky, who never once failed to show up for work, even reeling with a fever. Sabbath, as usual, was spending the evening with Rosanna, and so had not found out what happened till he got home half an hour before Nicky was due back from the theater. That was what was wonderful about having an actress for a wife. At night, you always knew her whereabouts and how long she would be gone. At first, he had thought that maybe she had gone out looking for him, maybe because she had had her suspicions. She had taken a circuitous route to the theater and had come upon Sabbath crossing the park with his hand on Rosanna's ass. She might well have seen them going through the front door of the brownstone where he had his tiny workshop room at the rear of the top floor. Nicky was explosive, crazily emotional, and could do and say bizarre things and not even remember them afterwards, or remember but fail to see why they were bizarre. Sabbath had been complaining to Rosanna that night about his wife's incapacity to separate fantasy from reality or to understand the connection between cause and effect. Early on in life, either she or her mother, or both conspiring together, had cast little Nicky as the blameless victim, and consequently she could never see where she was responsible for anything. Only on the stage did she shed this pathological innocence and take over, herself determining how things were going to come out, and with exquisite tact turn something imagined into something real. He told Rosanna the story of her slapping the face of the ambulance driver in London, and then talking to her mother's corpse for 3 days, about how, even down to a few days before her disappearance, Nicky was repeating how glad she'd been she'd said goodbye to Mama as she had, how satisfying that remained. She even made a crack, as she did each time she recalled the 3 days of fondling the corpse, about how cruel it was of the Jews to dump their dead as soon as they could, a remark that Sabbath decided once more not to call her on. Why correct that idiocy rather than all the other idiocies? In Miss Julie, she was everything she couldn't be outside Miss Julie. Cunning, knowing, radiant, imperious, everything but shrinking from the reality of the play. It was only the reality of reality by which she was benumbed. Nicky's aversions, her fears, her hysteria. He was full of grievance, yet another spouse absolutely steeped in it. Didn't know, he told Rosanna, how much more he could take. And he and Rosanna fucked, and she left, and he went to St. Mark's Place, and there were Norman and Link sitting on the steps of his building. Sabbath had hurried home to shower away Rosie's smell before Nicky got in. One night when Nicky believed Sabbath was asleep, she had begun to sniff under the blankets, and he realized only then that he had forgotten Rosie's visit at lunchtime and had gone to bed having washed his face and nothing more, and that was just a week earlier. Norman told him what had happened, while Link sat there with his head in his hands. Nicky had no understudy, and so, even though the house was sold out as it had been since the opening, the performance had to be canceled, the money refunded, and everybody sent home. And nobody could find Sabbath to tell him. His producers had been waiting on the steps for over an hour. Link, woefully racked by all this, pleadingly asked Sabbath if he knew where she was. Sabbath assured him that as soon as she had calmed down and begun to get over whatever it was that had upset her, she'd call and come back. He wasn't worried. Nicky could behave oddly, very oddly. They didn't know how oddly. This, said Sabbath, is just one of her strange things. But upstairs in the apartment, his 2 young producers made Sabbath call the police. He was in New York less than 5 minutes when he began to be haunted all over again by why. He had to restrain himself from using the tip of his muddied old boots, muddied from the treks out to the graveyard, to awaken one by one those bodies buried under their rags, to see if perhaps a white woman was among them who had once been his wife. Withdrawn, mannerly, intense, tremulous, unearthly, moody, mesmeric Nicky, a difficult personality impossible ever to grasp, whose mark on him was indelible, who could more confidently imitate someone than be someone, who'd clung to her emotional virginity until the day she disappeared, whose fears, even without danger or misfortune at hand, were streaming through her all the time, whom he had married out of sheer fascination with her gift at only 22 for artificial self-transformation, for duplicating realities she knew virtually nothing about, who unfailingly imparted to everything anyone ever said an inward, idiosyncratic, insulting significance, who was never really at home outside the fairy tale, a juvenile whose theatrical specialty was the most mature roles, into whom she had been changed by an existence free of him? What had become of her, and why? As of April 12, 1994, there was still no certification of her death, and though our need to bury our dead is strong, we have to first be sure the person is dead. Had she returned to Cleveland, to London, to Salonika to pretend there to be her mother? But she'd had neither a passport nor money. Had she run away from him or from everything? Or had she run away from being an actress just when it had become overwhelmingly apparent that she could not avoid an extraordinary career? That had already begun to terrify her, the demands of that kind of success. She would be 57 in May. He never failed to remember her birthday or the date she disappeared. What did Nicky look like now? Her mother before the formaldehyde or after? She had already outlived her mother by 12 years, if she had lived beyond November 7th, 1964. What would Morty look like now if he had walked away from his downed plane in 1944? What did Drenka look like now? If they dug her up, could you still tell she'd been a woman, the most womanly of women? Could he have fucked her after she was dead? Why not? Yes, fleeing for New York that evening, he'd believed he was running off to see Link's corpse. But it was the body of his first wife he could never stop thinking about. Her body, alive, that he might at last be shepherded to. It did not matter that the idea made no sense. Sabbath's 64 years of life had long ago released him from the falsity of sense. You would think this would make him deal better with loss than he did, which only goes to show what everyone learns sooner or later about loss. The absence of a presence can crush the strongest people. But why bring it up? He snarled at his mother. Why, Nicky, 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 when I'm close to death myself? And she finally spoke out, his little mother, who gave it to him on the corner of Central Park West and West 74th Street as she never dared to in life once he was 12 and already muscular and belligerently grown up. That's the thing you know best, she told him, have thought about most, and you don't know anything. Strange, Norman said, reflecting on Sabbath's tribulation. Sabbath waited to let sympathy work the man over a little before he quietly corrected him. Extremely, said Sabbath. Yes, Norman shot back. I think it's fair to say extremely. They were at the kitchen table, a beautiful table, large, glazed, ivory-colored Italian tiles bordered by bright, hand-painted tiles of vegetables and fruit. Michelle, Norman's wife, was asleep in their bedroom, and the two old friends, seated across from each other, were speaking softly of the night when Nicky failed to turn up at the theater and nobody knew where she was. Norman wasn't at all as at ease with Sabbath as he'd been on the phone the night before. The scope of Sabbath's transfiguration seemed to astonish him, in part because of his own mammoth treasure of satisfied dreams, apparent everywhere Sabbath looked, including into Norman's bright, brown, benevolent eyes, tan from a tennis vacation in the sun, and as thin and athletically flexible as he'd been as a young man. He showed no sign that Sabbath could see of his recent depression. Since he was already bald by the time he left college, nothing about him seemed changed. Norman was no fool, had read books and traveled widely, but to comprehend in the flesh a failure like Sabbath's appeared to be as difficult as coming to terms with Link's suicide, maybe more so. Link's condition he had observed worsening each year, while the Sabbath, who had forsaken New York in 1965, had virtually no affinity to the man sighing over a sandwich at the kitchen table in 1994. Sabbath had washed his hands, face, and beard in the bathroom, and still, he realized, he unnerved Norman no less than if he had been a tramp whom Norman had foolishly invited home to spend the night. Perhaps, over the years, Norman had come to inflate Sabbath's departure to a high artistic drama, a search for independence in the sticks, for spiritual purity and tranquil meditation. If Norman thought of him at all, he would, as a spontaneously good-hearted person, have tried to remember what he admired about him. And why did that annoy Sabbath? He was irritated not nearly so much by the perfect kitchen and the perfect living room and the perfect everything in all the rooms that opened off the book-lined corridor as by the charity that he, Sabbath, could inspire such feelings. Of course, entertained him. Of course, it was fun to see himself through Norman's eyes. But it was hideous as well. Norman was asking if Sabbath had ever come close to picking up Nicky's trail after she had disappeared. I left New York in order to stop trying, Sabbath replied. It bothered me sometimes to realize that she didn't know where I lived. What if she wanted to find me? But if she did, she'd find Rosanna, too. Once I was up in the mountains, I never allowed myself the pleasure of keeping Nicky in my life. I didn't imagine her with a husband and children. I was going to find her. She was going to turn up. I stopped all that. The only way for me to understand it was not to think about it. You have to take this bizarre thing and put it away in order to proceed with your life. What was the point thinking about it? And is that what the mountain represents? A place not to think about Nicky. Norman was trying to ask only intelligent questions, and they were intelligent, and they missed entirely the point of Sabbath's descent. Sabbath went on exchanging sentences with Norman that could as well have been true as not. It was a matter of indifference to him. My life was changed. I just couldn't go forward with that amount of speed anymore. I couldn't go forward at all. The idea of controlling anything went completely out of my head. The thing with Nicky left me, he said, smiling with what he hoped would be a wan expression, in a somewhat awkward position. I would think. If I had appeared at the door without having called from the road, if I had got by the doorman unnoticed and taken the elevator to the 18th floor and knocked on the Cowan's door, Norman would never have recognized the man in the foyer as me. With the oversized hunting jacket atop the Rube's flannel shirt and these big muddy boots on my feet, I looked like a visitor from Dogpatch. Either like a bearded character in a comic strip or somebody at your doorstep in 1900, a wastrel uncle from the Russian Pale who is to sleep in a cellar next to the coal bin for the rest of his American life. Through the lens of unforewarned Norman, Sabbath saw what he looked like, had come to look like, didn't care that he looked like, deliberately looked like, and it pleased him. He'd never lost the simple pleasure which went way back of making people uncomfortable, comfortable people especially. Yet there was something thrilling in seeing Norman. Sabbath felt much as poor parents do when they visit their kids in the suburbs who've made it big, humbled, mystified, out of their element, but proud. He was proud of Norman. Norman had lived in the theatrical shit world for a lifetime and had not himself become a stupid shit. Could he be so considerate on the job, so good-natured and decent and thoughtful? They would tear him to pieces. And still, to Sabbath, it seemed that Norman's humane disposition had only enlarged with age and success. There wasn't enough he could do to make Sabbath feel at home. Maybe it wasn't repulsion at all that he felt, but something like awe at the sight of white-bearded Sabbath come down from his mountaintop like some holy man who has renounced ambition and worldly possession. Can it be that there is something religious about me? Has what I've done, i.e., failed to do, been saintly? I'll have to phone Rosie and tell her. Whatever lay behind it, Norman couldn't have been more solicitous. But then he and Link, sons of prosperous fathers and Jersey City friends since childhood, could not have been kinder from the moment they set up their partnership fresh out of Columbia and paid the expenses arising from Sabbath's obscenity trial. They had extended to Sabbath that respect edged with reverence which was associated in Sabbath's mind less with the way you deal with an entertainer, the most he'd ever been, Nicky was the artist, than with the manner in which you approach an elderly clergyman. There was something exciting for these two privileged Jewish boys in having, as they liked to say then, discovered Mick Sabbath. It kindled their youthful idealism to learn that Sabbath was the son of a poor butter-and-egg man from a tiny working-class Jersey shore town, that instead of attending college, he had shipped out as a merchant seaman at 17, that he'd lived 2 years in Rome on the GI Bill after coming out of the army, that married only a year he was already on the prowl, that the spookily beautiful young wife whom he bossed around off the stage as well as on, an oddball herself, but obviously much better born than he, and probably, as an actress, a genius too, couldn't seem to survive half an hour without him. There was an excitement about the way he affronted people without caring. He was not just a newcomer with a potentially huge theatrical talent, but a young adventurer robustly colliding with life, already in his 20s a real lifer, urged on to excess by a temperament more elemental than either of their own. Back in the 50s, there was something thrillingly alien about Mick. Sitting safely in the Manhattan kitchen, sipping the last of the beer Norman had poured him, Sabbath was by now certain whose head Officer Balich had meant to split open. Either something incriminating had turned up in Drenka's belongings, or Sabbath had been observed at the cemetery at night. Wifeless, mistressless, penniless, vocationless, homeless. And now, to top things off, on the run. If he weren't too old to go back to sea, if his fingers weren't crippled, if Morty had lived, if Nicky hadn't been insane, if there weren't war, lunacy, perversity, sickness, imbecility, suicide, and death, chances were he'd be in a lot better shape. He'd paid the full price for art, only he hadn't made any. He'd suffered all the old-fashioned artistic sufferings, isolation, poverty, despair, mental and physical obstruction, and nobody knew or cared. And though nobody knowing or caring was another form of artistic suffering, in his case, it had no artistic meaning. He was just someone who had grown ugly, old, and embittered, one of billions. Obeying the laws of disappointment, disobedient Sabbath began to cry, and not even he could tell whether the crying was an act or the measure of his misery. And then his mother spoke up for the second time that evening, in the kitchen now, and trying to comfort her only living son. This is human life. There is a great hurt that everyone has to endure. Sabbath, who liked to think that distrusting the sincerity of everyone armed him a little against betrayal by everything. I've even fooled a ghost. But while he thought this, his head a lumpish, sobbing sandbag on the table, he also thought, and yet how I crave to cry. Crave, please. No, Sabbath didn't believe a word he said and hadn't for years. The closer he tried to get to describing how he arrived at becoming this failure rather than another, the further he seemed from the truth. True lives belonged to others, or so others believed. Norman had reached across the table to take one of Sabbath's hands in his. Good. They let him stay for at least a week. You, he said to Norman, you understand what matters. Yeah, I'm a master of the art of living. That's why I'm 8 months on Prozac. All I know is how to antagonize. Well, that and a few other things. A really trivial, really shitty life. The beers went to your head. When someone is exhausted and down like you, everything gets exaggerated. Link's suicide has a lot to do with it. We've all been through it. Repugnant to everyone. Come on, Norman replied, increasing the firmness of his hold on Sabbath's hand. But when was he going to tell him, I think you had better move in with us? Because Sabbath could not go back. Rosanna wouldn't have him in the house, and Matthew Balich had found him out and was furious enough to kill him. He had nowhere to go and nothing to do. Unless Norman said, move in, he was finished. Suddenly Sabbath raised his head from the table and said, my mother was in a catatonic depression from the time I was 15. You never told me that. My brother was killed in the war. I didn't know that either. We were one of those families with a gold star in the window. It meant that not only was my brother dead, my mother was dead. All day at school I thought, if only when I get home, he's there. If only when the war's over, he's there. What a frightening thing that gold star was to see when I came home from school. Some days I'd actually manage to forget about him, but then I'd walk home and see the gold star. Maybe that's why I went to sea, to get the fuck away from the gold star. The gold star said, people have suffered something terrible in this house. The house with the gold star was a blighted house. Then you get married and your wife disappears. Yes, but that left me all the wiser. I could never again think about the future. What did the future hold for me? I never think in terms of expectations. My expectation is how to deal with bad news. Trying to talk sensibly and reasonably about his life seemed even more false to him than the tears. Every word, every syllable, another moth nibbling a hole in the truth. "And it still throws you to think about Nicky?" "No," said Sabbath, "not at all. 30 years later, all I think is, what the fuck was that? It becomes more unreal the older I get, because the things I told myself when I was young, maybe she went here, maybe she went there, those things don't apply any longer. She was struggling always for something only her mother seemed able to give. Maybe she's out there looking for it still. That's what I thought then. At this distance, it's just, did all that really happen?" "And the ramifications?" Norman asked. He was relieved to see Sabbath back under control, but continued nonetheless to hold on to him, and Sabbath allowed him to, however annoying that had become. "Its effect on you. How did it injure you?" Sabbath took time to think, and this is more or less what he was thinking. These questions are futile to answer. Behind the answer there is another answer, and an answer behind that answer, and on and on. And all Sabbath is doing to satisfy Norman is to pretend to be someone who does not understand this. "I seem injured?" They laughed together, and Norman only then let go of his hand. Another sentimental Jew. You could fry the sentimental Jews in their own grease. Something was always moving them. Sabbath could never really stand either of these two morally earnest, super-coddled successes, Cowan or Gelman. "That's like asking how much did it injure me to be born. How can I know? What can I know about it? I can only tell you that the idea of controlling anything is out of my mind. And that's how I choose to move along in life." "Pain, pain, so much pain," said Norman. "How can you possibly get over minding it?" "What difference would it make if I minded? It wouldn't change anything. Do I mind? Never occurs to me to mind. Okay, I got over-emotional, but minding. What's the point of minding? What was the point of trying to find reason or meaning in any of these things? By the time I was 25, I already knew there wasn't any. And isn't there any? Ask Link tomorrow. When they open the coffin, he'll tell you. He was antic and funny and full of energy. I remember Lincoln very well. He didn't want to know anything ugly. He wanted it to be nice. He loved his parents. I remember when his old man came backstage, a carbonated drink manufacturer, a tycoon in seltzer, if I remember correctly. No, Quench. Quench, that was the stuff. Quench, Wild Cherry sent Link to Taft. Link called it Kvetch. A sun-tanned little endure with steel-gray hair, the old man. Started out with just the crap he bottled in a truck he drove himself, in his undershirt. Crude, ungrammatical, built like something that had been baled. Link was sitting on a chair in Nicky's dressing room and just took his father and pulled him onto his lap and held him there while we were all talking after the show, and neither of them thought anything of it. He adored his old man. He adored his wife. He adored his kids. At least when I knew him, he did. He always did. So, where's the meaning? I have some ideas. You don't know anything, Norman. You don't know anything about anyone. Did I know Nicky? Nicky had another life. Everybody has another life. I knew she was eccentric, but so was I. I understood I wasn't living with Doris Day, a little irrational, out of touch, prone to crazy outbursts, but irrational enough and crazy enough for what happened to happen? Did I know my mother? Sure. She went around whistling all day long. Nothing was too much for her. Look what became of her. Did I know my brother? The discus, the swimming team, the clarinet, killed at 20. Disappear, even the word is strange. Stranger is the word reappear. So how is Rosanna? Sabbath looked at his watch, a round stainless steel watch, half a century old this year, black face, white luminous dial and hands. Morty's Army Benrus, with 12 and 24-hour numbers and a second hand you could stop by pulling on the crown for synchronization when you flew a mission. A lot of good the synchronization did Morty. Once a year, Sabbath sent the watch to a place in Boston where they cleaned and oiled it and replaced worn-out parts. He had been winding the watch every morning since it became his in 1945. His grandfathers had laid tefillin every morning and thought of God. He wound Morty's watch every morning and thought of Morty. The watch had been returned by the government with Morty's things in 1945. The body came back 2 years later. "Well," said Sabbath, "Rosanna. Just about 7 hours ago, Rosanna and I split up. Now she's disappeared. That's what it comes down to, Mort. Folk disappearing left and right. Where is she? Do you know?" "Oh, at home." "Then it's you who have disappeared." "Trying," said Sabbath, and again, suddenly, a great onslaught of tears, anguish so engulfing that in the first moment he could no longer even ask himself whether or not this second collapse of the evening was any more or less honestly manufactured than the first. He was drained of skepticism, cynicism, sarcasm, bitterness, mockery, self-mockery, and such lucidity, coherence, and objectivity as he possessed had run out of everything that marked him as Sabbath except desperation. Of that he had an abundance. He had called Norman Mort. He was crying now the way anyone cries who has had it. There was passion in his crying, terror, great sadness, and defeat. Or was there? Despite the arthritis that disfigured his fingers, in his heart he was the puppeteer still, a lover and master of guile, artifice, and the unreal. This he hadn't yet torn out of himself. When that went, he would be dead. "Are you all right, Mick?" Norman had come around the table to place his hands on Sabbath's shoulders. "Did you leave your wife?" Sabbath reached up to cover Norman's hands with his own. "I have amnesia suddenly about the circumstances, but yes, it appears that way. She's no longer enslaved by alcohol or me, both demons driven out by AA. What it probably comes down to is she wants to keep the paycheck for herself. She was supporting you. I had to live. Where will you go after the funeral?" He looked at Norman, smiling broadly. "Why not with Link?" "What are you telling me? You're going to kill yourself? I want to know if that's what you're thinking. Are you thinking about suicide?" No. I'll go on to the end." "Is that the truth?" "I'm inclined to think so. I'm a suicide like I'm everything, a pseudo-suicide." "Look, this is a serious business," Norman told him. "We're now in this together." "Norman, I haven't seen you in 100 years. We're not in anything together." "We are in this together. If you're going to kill yourself, you're going to do it in front of me. When you're ready, you have to wait for me to get there and then do it in front of me." Sabbath did not reply. "You have to see a doctor," Norman told him. "You have to see a doctor tomorrow. Do you need money?" From his wallet, full of illegible notes and telephone numbers scribbled on paper scraps and matchbook covers, fat with everything but credit cards and cash, Sabbath fished out a blank check for his and Rosanna's account. He made it out for $300. When he realized that Norman, watching him write, saw printed on the check the names of husband and wife both, Sabbath explained, "I'm cleaning it out. If she's beaten me to it and it bounces, I'll send you back the cash." "Forget that. Where's $300 going to get you? You're in a bad way, boy. I have no expectations." "You tried that on me. Why don't you sleep here tomorrow night, too? Stay as long as you need us. All the children are gone. The baby, Deborah's, away at Brown. The house is empty. You can't rush off after the funeral not knowing where you're going and feeling the way you do. You have got to see a doctor." "No," said Sabbath. "No, I can't stay here." "Then you have to be hospitalized." And this brought forth Sabbath's third round of tears. He had cried like this only once before in his life over Nicky's disappearance, and when Morty died he had watched his mother cry worse than this. Hospitalized. Until that word was spoken he had believed that all this crying could easily be spurious, and so it was a considerable disappointment to discover that it did not seem to be within his power to switch it off. While Norman coaxed him up out of the kitchen chair and walked him across the dining room, through the living room, and down the corridor into Deborah's room, then steered him onto the bed, untied the caked laces of his dog-patch boots and pulled them off his feet, Sabbath shook. If he was not coming apart, but only simulating, then this was the greatest performance of his life. Even as his teeth chattered, even as he could feel his jowls tremble beneath his ridiculous beard, Sabbath thought, so, something new, and more to come, and perhaps less of it to be chalked up to guile than to the fact that the inner reason for his being, whatever the hell that might be, perhaps guile itself, had ceased to exist. He managed only 3 words Norman could fully understand. "Where is everybody?" "They're here," Norman said to soothe him. "They're all here." "No," replied Sabbath once he was alone. "They all escaped." While Sabbath ran a bath in the girlishly pretty pink and white bathroom just off Deborah's room, he interested himself in the contents, all jumbled together, of the 2 drawers beneath the sink, the lotions, the ointments, the pills, the powders, the body shop jars, the contact lens cleaner, the tampons, the nail polish, the polish remover. Working through the clutter to the bottom of each drawer, he found not a single photograph, let alone a stash of the kind Drenka had unearthed from among Sylvia's things during the next to last summer of her life. The one item at all beguiling, aside from the tampons, was a tube of vaginal lubricating cream twisted back on itself and nearly empty. He removed the cap to squeeze a speck of the amber grease onto the palm of his hand and rubbed it between his thumb and his middle finger, remembering things as he smeared the stuff over his fingertips, all sorts of things about Drenka. He screwed the cap back on and set the tube out on the tiled counter for experimentation later. After undressing in Deborah's room, he had looked at all the photographs in their transparent plastic frames on her bureau and desk. He would get to the drawers and closets in time. She was a dark-haired girl with a demure, pleasing smile, an intelligent smile. He couldn't tell much else because her figure was hidden from view by the other young people in the pictures. Yet of all the faces, hers alone had about it at least a touch of the enigmatic. Despite the juvenile innocence she so abundantly offered the camera, she looked to have something of a mind, even some wit, and lips whose protuberance was her greatest treasure, a hungry, seductive mouth set in the most undepraved face you could imagine. Or that's how Sabbath read it at close to 2 a.m. He had been hoping for a girl more tantalizing, but the mouth and the youth would have to do. Before getting in the bath, he trundled in the nude back to her bedroom and took from the desk the largest picture of her he could find, a photograph in which Deborah was nestled up against the muscular shoulder of a burly redhead about her age. He was beside her in virtually every photograph, the deadly boyfriend. All Sabbath did for the moment was lie in the wonderful warm bath in the pink and white tiled bathroom and scrutinize the picture, as though in his gaze lay the power to transport Deborah home to her tub. Reaching out with one arm, Sabbath was able to raise the lid to expose the seat of Deborah's pink toilet. He rubbed his hand round and round the satiny seat and was just beginning to harden when there was a light rap on the bathroom door. "You all right in there?" Norman asked, and pushed the door open a ways to be sure Sabbath wasn't drowning himself. "Fine," said Sabbath. It had taken no time to retract his hand from the toilet seat, but the photograph was in the other hand, and the twisted tube of vaginal cream was up on the counter. He held out the picture so Norman could see which one it was. "Deborah?" Sabbath asked. "Yes, that is Deborah." "Sweet," said Sabbath. "Why do you have the photograph in the bathtub?" "To look at it." The silence was indecipherable. What it meant or foretold, Sabbath could not imagine. All he knew for sure was that Norman was more frightened of him than he was of Norman. Being nude also seemed to bestow an advantage with a conscience as developed as Norman's, the advantage of seeming defenselessness. Sabbath's talent for this sort of scene Norman could not hope to equal. The talent of a ruined man for recklessness, of a saboteur for subversion. even the talent of a lunatic, or simulated lunatic, to overawe and horrify ordinary people. Sabbath had the power, and he knew it, of being no one with anything much to lose. Norman hadn't seemed to notice the vaginal cream tube. Which of us is lonelier at this moment, Sabbath wondered, and what is he thinking? Enter our terrorist. I should drown him. But Norman needed admiration in the ways that Sabbath never had, and more than likely he wouldn't do it. It would be a shame, Norman finally said, if it got wet. Sabbath didn't believe he had an erection, but an ambiguity in Norman's words caused him to wonder. He didn't look to see, but instead asked a perfectly innocent question. Who's the lucky boy? Freshman year sweetheart, Robert. Norman spoke with his hand extended toward the photograph. Only recently replaced by Will. Sabbath leaned forward in the tub and handed the photograph over, noting, alas, as he moved, his dick angled upward in the water. You're feeling like yourself again, Norman said, staring Sabbath in the eyes. I am. Thank you. Much better. It's never been easy to say what you really are, Mickey. Oh, failure will do. But at what? Failure at failing, for one. You always fought being a human being, right from the beginning. To the contrary, said Sabbath. To being a human being, I've always said, let it come. Here, Norman picked up the vaginal cream from the tile counter, opened the bottom drawer beneath the sink, and tossed in the tube. He seemed to have surprised himself more than Sabbath by the force with which he slammed the drawer shut. I've left a glass of milk on the nightstand, Norman said. You may need it. Warm milk sometimes helps sedate me. Great, Sabbath said. Good night. Sleep tight. As Norman was about to leave, he took a look over at the toilet. He would never guess why the cover was up, and yet the final glance he turned on Sabbath suggested otherwise. After Norman's departure, Sabbath lifted himself out of the tub and, dripping water as he moved, went to get the photograph from where Norman had returned it to Deborah's desk. In the bathroom again, Sabbath opened the drawer, withdrew the vaginal cream, and held the tube to his lips. He squirted a pea-sized glob on his tongue and rolled it across his palate and up against his teeth. A vaguely Vaseline-like aftertaste, that was all. But then what was he hoping for? The tang of Deborah herself? Back in the tub with the photograph, he resumed at the point where he had been interrupted. Up not once to use the John, first time in years. The father's milk pacifying the prostate. Or was it the daughter's bed? First he'd removed the fresh pillowcase and, scavenging with his nose, hunted down the odor of her hair clinging to the pillow itself. Then, by a process of trial and error, he detected a barely perceptible furrow just to the right of the mattress's vertical midpoint, a minuscule groove cast by the mold of her body, and between her sheets on her caseless pillow, in that groove, he had slept. In this Laura Ashley'd room of pink and yellow, a computer comatose on the desk, a Dalton school decal decorating the mirror, teddy bears tumbled together in a wicker basket, Metropolitan Museum posters up on the walls, K. Chopin, T. Morrison, A. Tan, V. Wolfe in the bookcase, along with childhood favorites, The Yearling, Anderson's Fairy Tales, and on the desk and the dresser framed photographs in abundance of the gang wearing swimsuits, skiing gear, formal attire. In this candy-striped room with the flowery border where she'd first fallen upon her clitoral entitlements, Sabbath was himself 17 again, aboard a tramp steamer full of drunken Norwegians docking at one of the great Brazilian ports, Bahia, at the entrance of Todos os Santos Bay, the Amazon, the great Amazon unwinding not far away. There was that smell, unbelievable, cheap perfumed coffee and pussy. His head wrapped around with Deborah's pillow, a full-body press on her groove, he was remembering Bahia, where there was a church and a whorehouse for every day of the year. So said the Norwegian seaman, and at 17 he had no reason not to believe them. Be nice to go back and check it out. If she were mine, I'd send Deborah there for her junior year. Free play for the imagination in Bahia. With the American sailors alone she'd have the time of her life. Hispanic, black, even Finns, Finnish Americans, every type of redneck, old men, young boys. Learn more about creative writing in 1 month in Bahia than 4 years at Brown. Let her do something unreasonable, Norman. Look what it did for me. Whores played a leading role in my life. Always felt at home with whores, particularly fond of whores. The stew-like stink of those oniony parts. What has ever meant more to me? Real reasons for existence then, but now, preposterously, the morning hard-on was gone. The things one has to put up with in life. The morning hard-on, like a crowbar in your hand, like something growing out of an ogre. Does any other species wake up with a hard-on? The whales? The bats? Evolution's daily reminder to male Homo sapiens in case overnight they forget why they're here. If a woman didn't know what it was, it might well scare her to death. Couldn't piss in the bowl because of that thing. Had to force it downward with your hand. Had to train it as you would a dog to the leash, so that the stream struck the water and not the upturned seat. When you sat to shit, there it was, loyally looking up at its master. There, eagerly waiting while you brushed your teeth. What are we going to do today? Nothing more faithful in all of life than the lurid cravings of the morning hard-on. No deceit in it, no simulation, no insincerity. All hail to that driving force. Human living with a capital L. Takes a lifetime to determine what matters, and by then it's not there anymore. Well, one must learn to adapt. How is the only problem. He tried to think of a reason to get up, let alone to go on living. Deborah's toilet seat, a glimpse of Link's corpse, her things, and remembering, delving into the things, he was out of the bed and across to the dresser beside the Bang & Olufsen music system. Brimming, a treasure trove, brilliant hues of silk and satin, childish cotton underpants with red circus stripes, string bikinis with satin behinds, stretch satin thong bikinis. Floss your teeth with those thongs. Garter belts in purple, black, and white. Renoir's palette. Rose, pale pink, navy, white, purple, gold, red, peach. Underwired, black embroidered bras. Lace push-up bras with little bows. Scalloped lace half-bras. Satin half-bras. C-cup. A viper's nest of multicolored pantyhose in white, black, and a chocolatey brown, sheer silk lace pantyhose of the kind that Drenka wore to drive him nuts, a delicious butterscotch color silk camisole, leopard print panties with matching bra, lace body stockings, 3 and all black, a strapless black satin bodysuit with padded push-up cups, edged with lace and hooks and straps, bra straps, garter straps, Victorian corset straps. Who in his right mind doesn't adore straps? All the abracadabra of holding and lifting. And what about strapless? A strapless bra. Christ, everything works. That thing they call a teddy. Roosevelt, Kennedy, Herzl, all in one, a chemise up top and down below, loose-fitting panties with leg holes that you slip right into without removing a thing. Silk floral bikini underpants, half-slips. Love the outmoded half-slip. A woman in a half-slip and a bra standing and ironing a shirt while seriously smoking a cigarette. Sentimental old Sabbath. He sniffed the pantyhose to find a pair that hadn't been washed, then headed with it for the bathroom. Sat to piss the way Dee did. Dee's seat, Dee's pantyhose. But the morning hard-on was of the past. Drenka. It was a crowbar with you. 52 years old, a source of life to 100 men, and dead. It isn't fair. The urge, you've seen it over and over again, done it over and over again, and 5 minutes later, it fascinates you again. What every man knows, the urge to indulge again. I should never have given it up, thought Sabbath, the life of the sensual port like Bahia, even of the shitty little ports around the Amazon, literally jungle ports, where one could mix with the crews of all kinds of ships, sailors of as many colors as Debbie's underthings, from all kinds of countries, and they were all going to the same place, all ending up in the whorehouse. Everywhere, as in a lurid dream, sailors and women and sailors, and I was learning my trade. The 8 to 12 watch, and then working all day as a seaman on deck, chipping and painting, and then the watch, the sea watch in the bow of the ship, and sometimes it was gorgeous. I'd been reading O'Neill. I was reading Conrad. A guy on board had given me books. I was reading all that stuff and jerking myself off over it. Dostoevsky, everybody going around with grudges and immense fury, rage like it was all put to music, rage like it was 200 pounds to lose. Raskolnikov, I thought. Dostoevsky fell in love with him. Yes, I would stand in the bow on those starry nights in the tropical sea and promise myself that I would stick at it and go through all the shit and become a ship's officer. I would urge myself to do all those exams and become a ship's officer and live like that for the rest of my life. 17, a strong young kid. And like a kid, I didn't do it.